Then leads us on to some more of the legal issues, and Sarah Jane will run us through those.
So now that hopefully the commercials have been agreed, and the JV structure has been signed off, we often find it best to work through a handful of key legal issues. And this stage is all about picking out what is likely to be the tougher points for the JV parties to agree, having robust discussions, and which may see each party making some concessions to get the deal over the line. This work should be done up front in advance of getting into the actual drafting of the JV, the shareholders agreement, if you like. In our experience, this preliminary discussion stage can save all parties time and costs when it comes to actually getting pen to paper and seeing the detail of all the pages in their glory. So we tend to break this kind of section down into three parts: entry into the JV, operation of the JV, so going forward, and then finally exit from the JV, or winding up. So turning now first to, I guess, entry, the first point to consider is governance. How is the joint venture going to be managed? Is it one board? Or should it be a board with subcommittees or even project teams? It may be too early from the outset to kind of consider those, to make clear what those are, but consideration should be given as to whether it's likely to move into those sort of areas. How many people should be on the governing board? In our experience, it often works best to have an odd number of participants to avoid the potential for any deadlock. You don't want to get a board that is too big and you end up with probably too many cooks in the kitchen where decisions cannot actually be made. So in our experience, 3 to 5 is often a pretty good starting point. So then how many people do each JV partner get to appoint? Is it 1? Is it 2? Or are all parties to be appointed by jointly together? If a party does have rights to appoint into the board, say for example directors, do those rights change based on the interest that the JV partner has in the joint venture? So for example, you have a 20% interest, you've got a right to appoint 1 party to the governing board. You drop below that, your right falls away. Are there any board members that should be appointed by agreement? And if it is to be agreement, what is that threshold? Is it a simple majority, which under the Companies Act is 50.5, or should it be 75, or unanimous? When you're kind of considering the consent thresholds, you should take into consideration what the parties are going to start with at the outset, and the likelihood that the parties could be diluted, or that there could be a change between the two. Should there be any independent board members? Someone who's got particular skills in the industry in which the JV is going to be operating, but not as necessarily aligned to any of the JV partners. It's important to consider the mix of the people on the board. Studies have shown that diversity, particularly diversity of thought, can lead to governing structures that are more successful in the long term. Should there be a chairperson? And how is the first chairperson appointed? Is it by agreement, or does one joint venture party get to appoint the first, and then it's on a rotational basis where each joint venture kind of party gets to appoint? How long should the chairperson be on the board for, be appointed for? How often should the board meet? Should it be on a monthly basis? Should it be on a quarterly basis, 6 monthly? Or should it just be on an as-needed basis that kind of needs to kind of be given some flexibility to ebb and flow as the JV develops? And then who should be part of the senior team, which is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the JV? Again, when from the outset, it may not be that there is necessarily a clear board and their management team, or it may be that there is just one party starting out and that member sits on the board. But consideration should be given as to how the parties intend for the JV to grow and what success in the short term may look like, and how that senior management team could be structured and resourced. Secondly, will the JV entity contract with any of the JV partners? Will there be a form of services of the JV to a JV partner? Or will there be services from the JV partner into the JV, like management services, like we talked about before? Or will there be some licensing of IP? If there's going to be any of these kind of interrelationships, then care should be taken as to kind of how they are structured, what each party is bringing to the table, how long those relationships are going to be for. Are they exclusive relationships? And then what happens if there's issues within the JV? Should those relationships continue? Or should the relationships go hand in hand with being part of the JV and having those kind of services type relationships?
So Sarah Jane's run through there a series of things that the JV parties need to think about. Now, thinking about it's all well and good, but they need to come to some sort of agreement at some stage. There needs to be a way of making decisions between the parties. Now, this is where a joint venture gets a little bit different to your standard company. While shareholders and directors in a company will normally have a pretty common sense of purpose and a common reason for being to create the entity that they're in, joint ventures can be a little bit different. While that common purpose is really important and it's the thing that the parties to the joint venture are driving towards, the reason for being in the background can sometimes be quite different. And Sarah Jane touched on this point just before. Quite often the shareholders in an entity have put together their interests for that common goal. In a joint venture, it's not necessarily always the case. While that common purpose is really important and the particular parts of each entity are put into the joint venture to try to achieve that common purpose, you're more often going to have parties involved who are in it for themselves is not the right way to say it, but are looking for some type of advantage. And we do tend to see that. And what we need to then concentrate on is a way of ensuring that those more personal goals, more peripheral distractions can be overcome for the purpose of ensuring that the joint venture stays on track. So there are different ways of achieving that decision making. Again, they're quite similar to the way that a company and a shareholders agreement will go about doing things. But with the joint venture being that slightly different beast, they tailor them slightly more. Ways of doing this, an easy way is a list of reserved matters. So you come up as a group, as your joint venture parties, with a list of things that say we either need to all agree on this, we need 3/4 of us to agree, or half of us to agree. And that can be a very long list or a very short list. It really depends on the parties. But at least it gives you some sort of guidance as to if we're going to give a guarantee, or if we're going to look to raise more capital, or if we're going to start operating in a geographical area which is outside where we thought we'd be operating, or if we're going to do something completely different to what we thought we'd be doing in the first place, just because the wheels have turned and gone around the corner, then we have some guidance on what's required in terms of making that decision when we have the joint venture parties together at the table. It's always the case that a joint venture is going to be more successful if the parties can get on and can put in place structures to enable that type of decision making. Without being able to make a decision, you tend to end up in a deadlock situation. If you're in a deadlock situation, the standard fallback is nothing changes. But nothing changes is not always the right answer. Sometimes things need to change. Sometimes decisions need to be made. And it is a technique, in some cases, to simply leave deadlock as the way of resolving these sorts of issues. If you can't reach an agreement, what do you do? So the next stage from there is you move into a dispute resolution process. Again, there's no real magic to these. They tend to be the same as you would expect under a shareholders agreement, but you've got different entities involved. And again, they've got those outside reasons for being part of the joint venture with the common purpose. It's obviously going to be easier for everybody if everyone gets along. So the first stage has always got to be just talk to each other. From where we sit, just talking to each other sometimes works. It means that neither Sarah Jane nor I can retire on the result, but simply getting people in a room and talking tends to work well. These sorts of disputes are very rarely solved by email. Anybody can write anything in an email. You don't have to be brave, you don't have to be in front of anybody. Press send and forget about it. It doesn't work that well. If you can get around that table, then you've got a good chance. If you can't resolve it at that point, then how do you change from there? Now, the traditional dispute resolution clause was CEOs, mediation, arbitration, court. Gets a bit brutal down towards the end, and again, it's something you want to try to avoid. So mediation is remarkably successful. Those of us who are old enough to remember when it came in to begin with will remember the technique of simply writing your numbers down on a piece of paper, handing it to the mediator. He came up with the average, and that was the answer. It doesn't always work like that. Mediation can take a number of different forms. It doesn't have to be an adversarial process. It doesn't even have to be mediation. In some cases, depending on what the topic is, depending on what the subject matter is, it may be a better idea to get an expert in the field in to either assist with the discussion, which tends to give a better answer in our experience, or for the third party to come in and operate as an expert and look at what the problem is and say, there's the answer. That's what we're going to do. You need to be brave to run down that track, and it's a bit like a Russian roulette option. Doesn't always work. You don't always get the result you want, but you will get an answer. But it's unlikely to create an atmosphere in which the joint venture is going to continue to operate for that common purpose. So the common purpose needs to be front and centre in any of these types of dispute resolution processes. What you can't afford to lose sight of is the reason that you got together with the other party or other parties in the first place. There must have been something there. There must be something that they are bringing that you need in order to achieve that goal. So again, the best way to try to resolve these things is simply to talk about it. If that doesn't work, then yes, the nuclear options are at the end of that list. Arbitration or High Court, or perhaps an agreement that if resolution can't be reached, then the subject matter of your joint venture is put on the market or is broken up, or something else. We'll go back to Sarah Jane to run us through what that might be.
So just also one of the considerations should be, what is the business's cash runway? Obviously, for most parties who come into the joint venture is not intended to be an endless pit of money. So parties should consider what is possible future funding requirements from the existing joint JV partners. Are these going to be fixed funding requirements? So there's kind of a known plan where at certain points along the journey, the business is going to need some injection of capital. Or will the parties need to contribute that capital based on how they're using the JV, how they're dealing with the JV, or just that one party is simply the funding party? Or is it like that the contributions are going to need to be made to maintain the ownership interest, so that each time business needs funding, the parties are going to have to contribute based on the proportions of shareholding or percentage that they ownership or control. What happens if there's a higher than anticipated burn rate of cash? What happens if a partner is no longer in the same financial position and therefore no longer able to fund the JV in the same manner as anticipated? It may be that the parties need to consider bringing in a third-party investor to help keep the JV alive. And if so, what is it the parties should give consideration as to what amounts are likely to be raised, what timeframes, and whether the parties have any preset valuations for the JV that are to be achieved. We are seeing this quite regularly, that with JVs there is kind of intention that the pot of money that is started with is going to need to be topped up fairly quickly, and that parties are then making agreement as to needing to go out to get further capital and setting kind of rates at which they're going to need and kind of establish pre-money valuations for the JV. But what we are also saying is that you need to be careful about hardwiring and set targets within certain timeframes and what consequences if revenue or JV valuations are not met. We have seen deals where large parts of the negotiations have been focused around the targets and the consequences of failure. But 6 months down the track, the JV is nowhere near those overly ambitious targets. And the parties have basically had to go back to the JV agreement and put a line through it, as they simply need money to get the technology to the market. And it hasn't had the uptake, or the development team haven't got to the position of where they thought they would be. So whilst you can spend time agonising over, where you think the JV should be, you need to also consider building some flexibility into what happens if everything doesn't quite go according to plan. We talked about kind of bringing in a third party, and I think it's always really important, especially in JVs where there's kind of two entities at the start, to consider what it may look like if you need a third or more parties into the JV. And maybe that as you go down along the road, it becomes apparent that another party has a set of skills, set of funding that would be really useful to bring into the JV. So the initial parties should kind of stop and consider from the outset what it could look like if they are going to bring on a third or more parties. If you need funding, should the JV have to go to the existing parties, so you end up with kind of a preemptive rights process? Or should one of the JV partners have a first right of refusal? If all the parties turn down their rights, the preemptives or the first right of refusal, and you're looking to go have a third party, then what approval mechanisms are needed to bring that third party on board? Is it simply a board decision, or should one of the JV parties be able to veto who comes on board? Who's the kind of third wheel in the marriage? And are those veto rights appropriate? It may be that you kind of, as part of having a veto right, it's kind of you're going to put some parameters around what they are. And so you kind of look to kind of carve out those that are likely to be competitors of the JV investing in, or actually competitors of the JV partners, so that the JV partners are in some way protecting their investment. Parties should expect changes during the course of their relationship, and there should be some flexibility allowed in a JV, a shareholders agreement. Attempts to work through every possible issue that new partners could look to raise as they look to invest is likely to result in a lengthy and probably costly negotiations between the initial JV partners, and often do not add true value, mainly because the issues that a new JV partner is likely to arise are likely to be issues that the original JV partners probably haven't considered from the outset. So really our kind of a takeaway here is to not spend too much time agonising or second guessing what may or may not be acceptable to possible JV partners. New JV partners may result in changes to a JV agreement. And that's something that parties should just be comfortable with. It may not even be a bad thing to go back to the agreement and consider what is and what is not working. Where you started to where you are now. A JV agreement should really be a living document, especially for tech JVs where it's kind of industries are likely to change, sometimes overnight.
And that's a really good point, I think, is that a lot of the time, an awful lot of time, money, resource, energy is spent on things that you just can't predict. You're not crystal ball gazers, we're not either. We tend to have a reasonable idea of where you may end up, but part of the fun with the joint venture is actually getting there. So again, you've got that common purpose at the outset, and that's up here, but you're starting down here. And how you get there is all part of the fun. And the ability to change, the ability to review, the ability to perhaps think slightly differently is really important. Without that ability to change, to review, to discuss, to think, well, this doesn't work for us, but that might, you're going to have problems. On the topic of problems, one of the things that you probably want to get out of your joint venture is some money. You put all this time, effort, resource into the joint venture. What are you going to get out of it? We're here talking about technology joint ventures, commercial, corporate. Most commercial corporate entities are there to provide an income for their shareholders, for their stakeholders. Charitable joint ventures do exist, and the aims there can be quite different. So we'll leave those today. But ultimately, in a commercial entity, you want to get a return. So again, your joint venture agreement at the outset should set out how that return is going to be returned. How is the money going to be distributed amongst the joint venture partners? It can be as simple as net profit divided by proportional interest and divvy up. Doesn't always work. You may need to keep money in the venture. So it's the sort of thing that a little bit of crystal ball gazing is a good idea. Some structure around it is a good idea, but absolute cast iron, I'm going to take 35% out every 12 months, doesn't tend to work. You've got Company Act issues there around solvency as well to consider. But it may be that in putting your joint venture together, Party D has brought something that is so rare, so particular, so important that they deserve some sort of a preference. So you've got the same sorts of options that you have at a company for working out how the money flows. I suppose one of the points with a joint venture tends to be that there isn't a lot of debt often. The parties are there with their resources at the outset. But if there is debt, then thought needs to be given to, does that get paid first? If that debt is repaid first, does that then put a joint venture party in a better position than another one? Question, something to think about. And that may change along the way as well. As the venture develops, it may need more cash. Is that cash going to be equity? Is it going to be debt? How does that affect the way in which profits are returned? All good questions. No right or wrong answers, but just something to think about. Needs to be considered. Another area to consider is the respective interests of the joint venture parties. They are likely to be operating their own businesses elsewhere. And while the joint venture parties share a common purpose and they're pushing in that particular direction, holding hands into the future together, they are also likely to still be doing what they do on a day-to-day basis outside that JV. So you probably need some rules around what the parties can do, what they can't do, and it starts to look very like restrictive covenants or non-competition type arrangements. The joint venture aim needs to be protected, and it needs to be done in a way that ensures that the parties put their best efforts into the joint venture that they've agreed to be a part of. It depends on what your topic is, what your goal is, and how that's going to be arrived at, as to how that then impacts on what your day-to-day business is for the various JV parties. It may be that a geographical restriction is appropriate. That's going to be less appropriate in a tech type venture. So some thought needs to go into enabling parties to do what they do on a day-to-day basis while encouraging them to participate in the joint venture. It may be that particular types of business, if they are obtained or available to the joint venture parties on their own, need to be referred into the joint venture itself, and so that all the parties can get the benefit of it. Depending on who you are, where you are, those types of rules are going to change. You'll need to think about whether that's allowable at all, whether all efforts of all joint venture parties should be in the particular JV. If it is, then you'll restrict everybody from doing what they normally do on the outside. Does that restriction apply while the joint venture is in place? Does it apply afterwards? Does it continue to apply afterwards? It's something that needs to be thought about. And again, no right or wrong answer, but it's important that the joint venture is able to do what it is set up to do. If the joint venture parties are competing amongst themselves, then you're going to have a problem, and the JV isn't going to work as well as you hoped. And if it's not working as well as you hope, then you want to get out. Sarah Jane will tell us how.
So Andrew raised a good point in that the JV partners are most likely to be operating their own business in addition to kind of be involved in the JV that has common objectives. And it may not always be that this is the case. It may be that one of the JV partners was in there originally to help develop the tech, to build the tech, to grow it to a point. And once that tech's got to the point, and maybe that they no longer have a role, and indeed they no longer want a role. They want to go off and do something, another venture where they start from the ground up again. Maybe that a JV partner has just simply outgrown the JV in terms of the value that it got at the outset is no longer aligned with their own business. And so it just doesn't sit within the JV partners kind of group ideal to be part of that JV anymore. So what happens when a party just is simply no longer wants to be part of the JV? It's really important that these kind of discussions are had from the outset, that the parties kind of sit together and go, yep, we're in this marriage, we're here for a certain amount of time, but we also got to recognise that if while we're all happily holding hands, we consider how it may be that we actually break up. And if the parties have kind of spent some time thinking about that breakup and kind of work through the process when you actually get to the breakup stage, hopefully that'll go a bit smoother. So it may be that it's just simply clear that where there's two JV partners, one wants out, it's logical that they then offer their holding, their control to the other party. And it may be that there's then a process, a valuation process as to what that exiting party's holding is going to look like. You know, it may be that the parties agree that, you know, that price, or that you work through an external independent valuation process. Or it may be that if one party wants out, then it simply becomes a reason for the JV no longer to exist. So that the parties are then considering whether they're going to market and put the JV up for sale essentially, or on the flip side, to start to wind it down because it no longer actually has the functions that it once had. Another thing to consider is whether the JV partners should be able to substitute in someone else that's kind of part of their group, but where it's not really appropriate for that particular party to be involved in the JV anymore. And it's something that we often call a permitted transfer. It's like, you know, if they're within the same kind of group structure, can they transfer and substitute, and can one party stand in the shoes of another? Do you need, if you're going to go through that process, do you need to be able to show to your other JV partner that this new entity that's been established, or this new party that's coming in, has the financial backing, has, you know, exactly what you brought to the table originally, so they can get some comfort? And if there are more than 2 JV partners, what happens if some of them, but not all of you, want to exit? What happens if you've got a minority holding and they don't see the JV going in the same way as the other majority do? And this is when you start to look at what we call tags and drags. So the ability of the majority JV partners to kind of drag or force the minority to kind of be involved with an exit. And or if there is a majority looking to exit, but they're not necessarily concerned about bringing the minority with them, is the minority able to stick up their hand and say, hey, you can't leave me behind, I want to come with you on any exit? And so consideration should be had to whether what those kind of drag and tag thresholds look like, in terms of, you know, if it is simply a majority of over 50% exiting, or should it be a bigger exit, a 75, a 90% exit, where you're going to be triggering these kind of end of life, end of venture discussions. It's really important, I guess, that the process is clear enough that it's not really open to challenge between one party that feels aggrieved. You want to be able to build in a little bit of flexibility so that the parties all know right from the outset how that process is going to work. But you don't want to be, as Andrew mentioned before, absolutely too rigid in terms of too structured that it doesn't allow the parties to kind of move away from what's actually written in the paper. So what happens also, and as I mentioned it before, if you've got a services relationship or some form of relationship between a JV partner and a JV, what happens if that relationship no longer exists? You know, there's no longer a need for a licensing of IP in, or for a JV partner to take a license of IP. Should there be then, if that relationship no longer exists, should there be a reason for that party to exit from the JV? It may be that simply because the party no longer have a relationship, it doesn't need to be that they are no longer part of the JV. But on the other flip side, it could be that it's no longer appropriate for them to kind of stay in if they're no longer contributing, you know, or buying services from the JV.
And it may not even be that the party can't contribute any longer. It may be that they're in default of their obligations. They may be so disinterested that they have simply stepped away from what they had agreed to do. What do you do then? Again, it's something that should be thought about at the outset. And this is an area where you can look into the future. You can try to work out, well, what does non-performance mean? What does disinterest mean? And if that threshold is tipped over, what do we do about it? Do we want this party still to be part of our team, or do we have a fairly strict way of dealing with them? And you do tend to have a fairly strict way of dealing with them. Obviously, it's a whole lot harder if you've only got 2 parties in your joint venture. And if that's the case, then you're probably looking at winding everything up. We mentioned that earlier on today, so we probably don't need to go back through there. But if you're a multi-party joint venture with a disinterested party, or a non-performing party, or a defaulting party, then your agreement at the outset should step through a way in which that JV party can be removed from what you're doing. That will tend to run through a notice period if the breach is capable of being fixed. If it's not capable of being fixed, then again we just press that nuclear button and eject them. If they're to be ejected, then a little bit of thought needs to go into are they paid out, how are they paid out, what is the value that they are paid out at, have they brought IP or tech into the JV that the JV needs to continue to do what it's doing? And if so, how do you deal with that? Now that may well be covered under the initial license agreement to get the tech or the IP in the first place. And if that's the case, you want to make sure that the JV is still able to access that material. If we can't, then we've got a problem. But again, it's just something to think about. I won't go on too much about that now. We're coming to the end, so